Welcome back, David. I don't think I need to introduce David because I think everyone here knows who he is. So he's our own product. We are so proud. I mean, he's teaching at Harvard at the moment. He's the young star, I think real star in the whole field of China studies. I mean, in the younger generation, he's really young, I think. But he has published widely, I mean, especially on political economy, behavioral and experimental economics, history, and cultural economics. And I think he's also a rich fellow at NBER and global scholar at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He has published, I think, in all the top econ journals like JPE, QJE, AER. I think he was a student here actually. So I think without further ado, I think I will turn the stage to David. It's all yours, David.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I would very much would like to join you guys in California, but until then, I would like to entertain you with some of our latest research project. I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts and feedback. Okay, great. So this is a very much work in progress. Joined with Xiaoda from Chicago, and we'll try to describe and understand the how policy experimentation have been conducted in China over the last couple of decades, and hopefully this is very much a disruptive work and try to generate some new facts and new insights that can then help us understand to what extent China's growth and reform is attributed to the systematic policy experimentations. Okay. So let me start by stepping back a little bit and thinking about policy learning and policy experimentation more broadly speaking. Now, determining which policy to implement is one of the most important roles that governments around the world are trying to deal with. And many governments explicitly or implicitly are engaged in various forms of policy experimentations. By that I mean trying things out, and some might involve very rigorous sequence of trials and errors, and coupled with evaluation and so on. Some might even involve randomized control trials at the government level. But by and large, try to figure out in a very uncertain space of policies, try to figure out which works is one of the key functions of good governance. Now, the systematic policy experimentations that's happened in China since 1980s are quite unparalleled in the breadth and depth of duration regarding this endeavor the Chinese government has been taking. And many in the field of political economy or among scholars of Chinese economy has even attributed to the fact that the China's continued growth and smooth transition and reform is due to the very systematic policy experimentation the government has been initiating. Okay, so what we want to do in this project is try to bring some data to this issue. Try to describe and understand the policy experimentation that China has been conducted over the last 4 decades. So I want to be clear upfront that this is very much a project descriptive in nature, and what we want to do is try to look at all the policy experimentation that took place, and hopefully to be able to highlight some of the features that even in a very successful case such as China, policy experimentation is not something that's that easy to do because it oftentimes faces complicated political environment that can generate frictions, that can generate constraints. Okay, that will become hopefully a bit more clear in a second. So let me give you a big picture of what we want to do in this particular project. So part of the disruptive exercise that we're embarked on is to bring some new data. So we want to collect as comprehensive as we can on all the policy experimentations that initiated by the Chinese government over the last 4 decades. And this is going to cover about 139 ministries and commissions. Okay, so pretty much all the ministries at the central government level, we're going to be able to hopefully capture those. Okay, I'm going to start the talk with
David.
Yeah.
So a lot of the experiments were conducted at the local level.
Yeah.
Starting from village, township, county, right? But these are all central policy experiments.
So yes and no. So what we're going to be able to see is that as long as a policy gets to the level of, if the central government say this is something we want to try, and they start to playing the coordinated role of these are the places that should try it out, these are being included. Now, what's not going to be included, you're going to see in a second, are essentially policies that local, village, county level government try it out, and it get killed before it ever reaches the central government level. that's not going to be captured here. But if the local government tried out and the central government see this is a good idea, and they say, okay, the rest of the half the country tried it out, those will be included. So we don't take a particular stance on the very the origin of those policy ideas. Where does that come from? So I'll be a bit more clear about what's included here and
just I know you're probably going to say it, but what's the key word? I mean, I don't see the word experimentation very much.
Again, is the key. It's one of the key word. So in Chinese, there's it's a blend of words like experiment, experimentation, trials. It's oftentimes blending in one word. But we would try our best to cover anything that has the idea of and pilots and those things will be captured here. Okay, so I want to start with, after I sort of briefly show you the data and what's covered, and also importantly what's not covered here. I want to start by just fixing some ideas to go through one particular experimentation, which is a fairly large one, an important one, which is experimentation on county fiscal empowerment. So I want to use this as a case to demonstrate typically what's the structure of experimentation looks like in a space. And this is also one of the neat case where we can try to sort of closely trace the rollout and the impact of the experimentation. And this is what generate some of the facts that we're going to use to motivate some of the more broad exercises we're going to do. So in this particular experimentation, what I'm going to show you is that the early waves of the counties, this is experimentation at the county level. The early waves of the counties who joined the experimentation experienced very large positive effects from experiencing this fiscal empowerment reform. That's the new policy that's been tried. Okay, and then the treatment effects, if you will, flipped towards the latter part of the experimentation. That the experiment, if anything, actually hurt the county who joined the exact same policy towards the latter part of the reform. Okay, and I'm going to show you that this flipping or very large heterogeneity in the new policy treatment effects is quite largely due to the underlying selection of the policy. The experimentation sites is very positively selected in the beginning and it's become marginally negative selected towards the end. Okay, so that's going to sort of fix in our ideas, and then the rest of the paper is going to zoom out to the rest of the experimentation, and we're going to ask 3 questions. First is that if we look at all the policy experimentation that's conducted in the last 40 years in China, on average, are the experimentation sites representative in their selection? And I'm going to show you some evidence that there's widespread positive selection of experimentation sites. Even if you use very conservative tests, we can very confidently reject that at least 40% of the experimentation that's conducted significantly deviate away from representative, and they're deviating typically more in the direction of positive selection. Okay.
So David, you're probably going to tell us this too. Mm-hmm. Are you surprised that it's only 40%? Or do you think that that's really high at 40%? I mean, you would have asked me, I would have said 90%. But
so it depends on. So this is what I mean by conservative, in the sense of almost all experimentations. And 90% is actually remarkably correct to the actual number. Almost 90% of experimentation we can see they're positively selected. It's just that some of them you can attribute that to noise or randomness, and you want to put a confidence interval on it, and then for about 50% of those, we cannot really tell whether it's just by chance. But rest of the, if you see an experimentation with a t-stats of between treatment control t-stats equal to 10, it's unlikely due to chance. So that's what I mean by conservative. Okay, but by and large, you should think about, and I'm going to show you some graphs. You should think about almost every single experimentation is positively selected. Now that might not be an issue. That might be optimal. So I'm going to talk. Our second question is like, what drives this underlying deviation from the this? And the first exercise I want to do is that, can we justify this positive selection using recent experimental literature to think about if we incorporate learning related sort of objectives and very sophisticated optimal experimentation models? Can we justify the degree of positive selection that we see? Okay, and then the answer pretty much is no. Sort of a lot of these recent models will predict or suggest positive selection is something that's actually optimal, but very rarely you would be able to see optimal design that's positive selected at the level that we see empirically. Okay, and then in fact I'm going to show you some evidence that almost half of the positive selection that we see can be attributed to some type of misalignment of incentives, in the sense of central government to some extent really wants something close to representative, and then as they move down to the political hierarchy, it gets more and more deviating from positive selection. That the local government, provincial government who handle the experimentation start to do the experimentation only in the richest counties, for example. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of such political misalignment. And finally, the last question I want to ask is, why do we care? What's the consequence of such deviation from representativeness? If anything, if central government can fully account for the possible selection, it may not be a big issue. Also, the first thing I want to show you is that the type of signals, the type of information you can gather from experimentation really hinges on the underlying selection of the sites. So to the extent that the experimentation sites are massively possibly selected, that's going to bias the signal the central government gets. And central government is not sort of fully sophisticated about debiasing that. So I'm going to show you some evidence that the experimentation that are more possibly selected, which sort of almost by definition is going to generate more positive signal, are more likely to end up becoming national policy that get rolled out to the entire country. And this also going to generate a set of sort of patterns that those policies, in some sense, when they tried out in rich places and that they work, the central government tried it out. Those are going to be to have those policies potentially tailored to the richer places that starts to make the policy space to be more favored towards developing regions, because these are the policies that end up getting rolled out and didn't sufficiently try those policies out in the poorer places before rolling out. Okay, so this is the roadmap. Any other questions before I delve right in to show you the data?
Hi, David.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, what do you think of the following explanation for the deviation from representativeness? So suppose to improve economy, we need those 3 elements to be good.
Yep.
So now we want to test whether reform in one element works. So we need to make sure that the other 2 elements are good, right? So we go to the area where the other 2 elements are good. So in that sense, we make the experimentation not representative, right? But it is for us to do the experiment.
Yeah. No, I think that a slightly different way of asking your question is that, which I'll get to it in a little bit. Maybe you just get a very noisy signal of trying out the policy in a poor place because they couldn't even implement the reform. And then what's the point of trying it? You just don't learn much. And maybe the policy only works when you have a good sort of local state capacity and so on. So that's fine. And we're going to sort of consider that a little bit. But what becomes sort of problematic is that if the whole new experimentation space is conducted in rich places with the precondition that the new policy that's proposed to work, and those policies are more likely to become national policy because of the positive signal the central government gets. That still means that poor places get policy that's not suitable for them, and that could hurt sort of poor regions in China. And sort of in some sense, like simplest the takeaway is that almost every new policies might work in Shanghai. It might not work for Gansu. But given that the policies tried in Shanghai gets rolled for the rest of the country, Gansu get a lot of more policies that tailor for Shanghai, but not tailored for the poor places, and that can be problematic. And I'll get to some of this towards that.
So David, you may talk about this, but how is this related to the RCTs, which is not very popular in China, right?
Yeah.
In policy making.
Yeah. So it's broadly speaking, you can I'm going to talk a little bit about how this relates to RCT. There are some similarities of this. Look, one of the biggest critiques for RCT is external validity of some sort. And here, sort of for this, I'm not saying that this policy condition the Chinese government are doing is an RCT, but you can think about RCT or our test for representativeness is essentially benchmarking them against RCTs. But we're still going to come back to the point of external validity for the experimentation, because even if you achieve internal validity, actually, let me hold off on for a little bit, because I'm going to get through this for the case study of what exactly is the issue here regarding external validity, that even if you run an RCT at the local level, it might not be able to solve unless you sample your experimentation sample is the whole country. Otherwise, you're still going to get to the issue of external validity. Hopefully, it'll become more clear in 2 slides when I show you the case study. Okay, so let me show you very briefly about the data, and I'm happy to chat more about the data source sets later if anything's unclear. So as I said, our goal is to try to measure as comprehensively as we can about policy expectations, and we cover sort of the time range is covered from 1980 to 2020. Our primary data source is built on a database on the government's official documents. So overall, sort of, we screen out sort of partially manually and partially automatically on all the keywords that we think are associated with experimentation, 实验 or whatever, and that give us about 20,000 documents. Among those 20,000 documents, 4,000 of them are documents at the central government level. Now, those are important in the sense of those are documents that essentially tell from a central government perspective, what's the goal of the experimentation? What are the ministries that are involved in the experimentation? How it will be rolled out? Does it involve multiple waves? Which counties get selected? Does it allow for voluntary participation in the experimentation? How it gets evaluated on all that stuff at the meta level for experimentation, okay? And then we're also going to be able to match those with about 15,000 local government documents. For those who are familiar with, it's essentially that if a local region is called to be a part of experimentation, local municipal government, for example, is going to respond to the central government's calling by issuing their own policy document to say, this is how we're going to do the experimentation after we've been called to be part of the experimentation sites. And then from the local government documents, we're going to see the implementation details and sort of essentially also as a cross-check of the sites that get selected by the central government. Okay. So we're going to be fairly conservative about to the extent that if there are minor policy evolutions of the policy changes name, but it's still roughly about the same content, we're going to call them the same policy, even if it evolve over time. So this gives us about roughly 850 policy experimentations initiated by 139 ministries and commissions over this period. Now, importantly, and then related to Hongbin's question earlier, very early stage bottom-up experimentations that started in some counties and it got killed very quickly and never reached the central government level because it's just a bad idea. Those will never show up in our data sets. And we're sort of trying to find some way to at least get a sense of what those spaces will look like. Now, the policy that initiated by the local government and central government said, this is a great idea, let's try it out. Those will be part of our
but why didn't you encourage? It seems to me, I mean, when we, our group does a lot of RCTs, right? And we'll do RCTs that totally fail. Mm-hmm. And we learn a lot about those, right? They don't get upscaled, but we don't upscale them, right? Because they're, so is there any reason why you didn't include those?
So the simple, unsatisfying answer is that it's just hard to observe them because local government, when they first try something, they might not put that into official document. So given that's the space that we can observe. So in fact, what we're going for right now is that if the local government tried it and they're not sufficiently ashamed of it to put it in an official document, that's to give us some hope to want to capture those. But for now, it's just that if those trials don't exist in the policy document space, it's hard for us to know unless we sort of go out also to all the newspapers and so on. So that's another way to answer the question. I think for sure that for the policy that enter into this level of central government issue a document to say this is something I want to try it out, the average prior of how likely the policy will be to be successful is already very high. They already killed off a lot of the crazy ones or the ones that clearly are not going to work. So that's the level of selection we're not going to be dealing with. Now, there's another whole set that eventually we'll hopefully be compared against. There's also tons of policy in China that got rolled out to the whole country without going through any experimentation. That potentially is because central government are very confident this is something they want to do without any uncertainty. So how that compared to this middle range of sufficient uncertainty for them to try out, this is something that's more doable for us to do some benchmark against.
David, but this I think this is also important for people who don't know China that well. Most policies starting from bottom up or top down in China, or it's a mix of both.
So my view is a mixture of both in a sense of it gets back to the question of how did central government get the idea of these policies to try, and I think a lot of these ideas are sort of initiated by the local government, and then they sort of push them very strongly, and then but the speed of when the local government tried out a new idea, and then it get welcomed by central government, that period typically is less than 1 year. So then once they get to the central government level, you get to this massive sort of top-down operation of, okay, this is something that we want to systematically try out in these places. So I think it's a combination of top-down versus bottom-up. And some of the recent actually quality work in this literature actually sort of put, as it feels like, too much weight on the bottom-up part of this, where I think sort of bottom-up reached to the top-down version very quickly, and the whole process, I think. But also to be clear, I think what we are so far able to observe is selecting on a set of policies that reach the top-down level. So how many of those top-down version of this explanation looks like? Oh, and also hopefully by the end of the talk, I'm going to discuss a little bit about how this compared to policy experimentation in the Federalist system, where almost everything is from bottom up, and how the Chinese case compared to that. Okay, so what I'm showing you in this figure is just the count of policy experimentation that the central government initiated each year for the last 40 years. Okay, so you see a pattern that's inverse view. In the sense of like the policy experimentation sort of rolled out gets sort of increasingly so over time and reach the peak in the early 2010s and it's increasing fairly rapidly by about 50%. Okay, and this sort of inverse view pattern is actually fairly robust regardless of how you measure them and various sort of assumptions we can take. It's going to be a little bit out of the scope for today's talk, but we'll do a little bit more about this in the paper. Like how to explain this drop. It's your first instinct might be this is a Xi Jinping effect, which part of the general trend may be. But I think at the ministry level, what we see is that this coincides with the vertical reform of state bureaucracies in China by each ministry, that when they're essentially moving from a horizontal flexible or M-form organizational structure to a vertical structure, which is much more efficient. And that makes it less flexible to conduct experimentation. And we see that as each ministry is going through this verticalization reform, the number of experimentation that get initiated by the ministry start to drop. And I think part of this drop is due to sort of, they're essentially weakening the efficiency of ministry, but letting go of some of the flexibility that early sort of state bureaucracy had. Okay, so letting this sort of inverse view aside, what I want to do now is to show you a case about a particular experimentation and show you some of the style aspects that we really would like to sort of then generalize to the rest of the experimentations. So this county fiscal empowerment reform, for those of you who are familiar with, is at least in econ, is actually a fairly well studied experimentation because it's a very large one. The status quo is that provincial government sort of administers prefecture government administer county government, and many sort of has attributed the county government sort of failure to deliver a lot of the growth potential because of its lack of autonomy for these fiscal resources, because there are two layers above them. And to partially to guide the national policy to foster county level growth, since 2002, actually, sorry, a typo here, since 2002, the central government has begun experimentation on giving county government more fiscal autonomy. Sort of in a nutshell, that reform is essentially letting the county government bypass the municipal government, and the provincial government can directly allocate fiscal resources to the county, so that it get rid of the middleman of potential generate distortion. So that's reform. It's deliberately meant to increase the county's growth. Okay, it's a large experimentation. So over the course of 10 years, roughly, about half the counties in China participate in this experimentation by various ways. Okay, in the typical sort of nature of experimentation, where sort of, different batch of counties are joining throughout the period. Now, we don't know exactly how central government evaluated this policy, but as an applied economist, we can estimate sort of event study specification to look at what this particular reform did to each county who joined it. And we can control for county fixed effects. So we can look at the county before and after the joint reform, controlling for provincial by year fixed effects to get rid of the province specific time trend. And this is sort of one of, you can call it, this is the best thing that the applied economists can do to look at this. So I'm going to estimate this event study design to look at what this particular county empowerment reform did to the local economy for those who joined. Okay. I'm going to do this exercise separately. First, for the counties who joined the reform in the first half of the batch. So those who joined the particular experimentation before 2007, and then I'm going to do it separately for those who joined it in the second latter batch after 2007. Okay, so I'm plotting here the event study coefficient. What you see here is a fairly standard plot you see typically in the event study design, where there's no pre-trend, and then as soon as the county joined the reform in the first year and so on, it started to receive a boost in the local growth, just as the central government sort of intended for the reform to generate to the particular county. Okay, so that's all good news for the central government. If we repeat the exact same exercise on the latter batch of the county who joined the reform, you start seeing no pre-trend before, but the county who are now experiencing the exact same policy change start to get hurt by the fiscal empowerment towards the end. Okay. in fact, if anything, I can do this a bit more continuously. So we can call each year a batch of counties join the experimentation, and we can call that sort of a cohort of counties who join the experimentation as cohort 2005. And I'm going to include this join the experimentation plus minus 1 year, and then we can still estimate the event study in those moving narrow windows. And I'm showing you here the average treatment effects of this reform for the cohorts of the entire reform experimentation that joins. What you see here is that the reform really had a positive effect on those counties at the very beginning of the reform. And then the effects of the reform started to decrease over time, and it started to become even negative towards the very end of the reform. So that's just another way to say there is very strong heterogeneity in the exact same policy, and we see sort of almost a linear decrease in the effectiveness of reform to the policy to the counties that joins it. Now, what I want to show you next is that we can look at for each year. Look at the pre-experimentation characteristics of those counties, either their pre-experimentation GDP per capita or any measurement of socioeconomic status. We can compare the counties who joined the reform versus or experimentation versus the county who are part of the control group who central government didn't select to join the reform, and then we can compare those two, and then we can that will give us a t-stats. And you can think about the t-stats as a summary stats of how deviating from representativeness or randomness the site selection is. What I'm plotting here is the t-stats for each of the cohort of the counties who joined the reform over time. Okay, and you see a pattern that's actually fairly similar to the treatment effects that you saw earlier, where in the very beginning of the reform, you have a t-stats of 10. That essentially is giving out the reform or the experimentation only to the richest places in China. And you get gradually lower degree, a decreasing degree of positive selection, still on average more positive selected, and towards the very end, it starts to get marginally negative selected. Okay.
So, David, what's the N for each of those years? I mean, is over 2011, is that like 2,300 and 2003 is 1? I mean,
so they're fairly balanced. I don't know the number on top of my head. So there are 1,000 of them over the course of 10 years. So on average, it's about 100, but they're not sort of equally distributed. So on average, it's about sort of a little less than 100 or around that for each.
So most of these national policies are rolled out in 100 counties?
Not really. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to generate this. So we couldn't do this very sort of sharp kind of cohort by cohort analysis for many of the policies because they try out in 10 places, and then there's not much we can do for t-stats year by year. But this is one of the big ones where this plot is particularly sharp. Okay. So that large heterogeneous treatment effects, if we're just impose the linear structure on this to think about sort of, we can estimate how heterogeneous the treatment effects of this policy with respect to the pre-experimentation economic conditions. And then we can project the policy effect on the places that didn't get the reform, had the reform been rolled out to the entire country. And I'm showing you the simulated sort of policy effect for the entire country for this particular policy. And what you see here is that large heterogeneity, half the country would benefit from this reform, and some of them benefit very largely from this reform, the other half would lose. So the net effect of the policy is actually, if anything, very close to zero, but with very large distributional effects. Okay, so this is something that hopefully sort of I will be able to sort of take with you and convince you for the rest of the experimentation that we want to look at systematically, is that the type of, given the large cross-sample heterogeneity in a lot of these policies, the type of signals that the central government are able to get from experimentation is very much dependent on the underlying sort of site selection. You can get, for this particular policy, you can get positive average treatment effects of the experimentation, but net zero when it gets rolled out to the entire country. And then back to sort of Hongbing's question earlier, this would suggest an econometric sort of site selection bias. And in particular, what makes important is that this is abstracted away from internal validity, because we use event study to evaluate the policy. There might be additional biases if the central government are less sophisticated about the way to analyze the policies. So even if you just do everything you can, the best you can, I guess in this case, to analyze the policy effect, the type of signals you can get, it can still be biased just because the underlying site selection. And that's coupled with the heterogeneous treatment effects. Okay, so that's sort of part of what I mean by external validity that's hard to get around with, and even sort of thinking about sort of in the RCT environment. Okay. What I want to do next is do this pattern that I show you in the county fiscal empowerment reform holds more generally for the rest of the policy that we see in the data set.
Hey, David. So do you know if the central government finds the result of the experimentation is not good, would they reverse the reform?
So the typical, so yes and no. So very rarely central government come out to declare this is a big failure and let's scratch it. So the typical way of a failed reform is that they should review the reform every 5 years. And if the 5th year after the reform didn't get renewed, that's essentially sort of implicitly a failure for the reform because it didn't get rolled out to the entire country. And oftentimes it means a roll back to status quo for a lot of these policies. You see some very small number of cases where if the central government sort of in some sense for political sort of persuasion reasons, I think want the policy to fail because they can persuade their political opponents, they roll the policy out in Gansu just 1 year and they realize the policy is going to fail. And then they end the whole thing. Partly, I think just to show some evidence for the opponents of the policy, but that's a very small share of the policy we saw. Okay, so let's continue with the exercise. I'm going to now zoom out to this particular experimentation and look at all the policy experientations, the 850 of them. And I'm going to repeat the exercise, the first exercise, to look at whether the size selection is representative on average. Okay, so the way I'm going to do it is that we can do it in multiple ways, but this is one particular way of doing this. For each experimentation, we can compare the treatment sites or the sites that are being part of the experimentation with the control sites. Thinking that in the language of RCT, compare a range of pre-experimentation characteristics. I'm going to use GDP as a graph, but it doesn't matter which one. These are all very correlated. Okay. Then I'm going to use the simple t-stats for the comparison as a summary stats. The bigger the t-stats, adjusted for the underlying sort of degree of freedom, because different experimentation has different sort of treatment and control. They're very rarely balanced in terms of the size. But after all those adjustments, you can interpret the t-stats as a bigger the number, it means the more positive selected experimentation is. The 0 means sort of they're exactly identical between the treatment and control sites. Okay. So this is the distribution of the t-stats across the 850 experimentation that we see. Okay, this is back to Scott's question earlier. Like vast majority of the experimentation has t-stats above 0, so they're positively selected. A fairly long tail on either ends, but they're a fairly right share. And if we be very conservative, look at the vertical dots here, that's the confidence interval where we can reject with 90% confidence interval that this is not due to random chance. Then we can rule out at least 40% of the experimentation to be sort of representatively allocated. And this share, the vast majority being positively selected, and we can rule out about 40% of the sites being positively selected. This is actually very robust using various test procedures that we have, and so on.
Okay. David, there's a question that just came in through the chat room, and it's that are they using 1 or 2 or 50 or 75 counties over and over and over and over again? And so is Shanghai part of 750 of these experiments? That's an exaggeration, but do you see these experiment counties being used over and over?
So yes and no. So by and large, we don't see that, except for those. In Chinese, that's the Shi and Qu, or the sort of essentially the reform sort of demonstration zones that just gets, Shanghai gets a lot of the policy experimentation of various sorts, but those are sort of a handful of cities essentially. And apart from those who just constantly getting new policies, there's essentially a revolving door of different countries get different versions of the policies.
You can just give a map of all the, where it started, right? Whole country.
Yes, so if we want to do this a bit more dynamically and trace, and then that will be something that's similar to what I just showed you with the fiscal reform and so on. Yeah. Okay. A couple of additional facts I want to show you for the randomness is that we don't see this change over time. So it's equally positively selected in 1980 than 2010. There is, however, sort of fairly large heterogeneity by ministry or by sort of policy domain as you wish. But what's interesting is that you actually, one way to get around sort of, to justify possible selection is that if the policy that, it's not meant to learn a national policy, you just meant to target. And for the policy domain that you have more room to have regional policies than the national uniform policies, that may be more justifiable to have possible selection because you're not meant to have representativeness in the first place. Now, if anything, you see that those national policies, the policies that are only reasonable at national level, are actually more possibly selected: tax policies, education policies, and so on. And for agriculture policy, you oftentimes see regional policies, and targeted actually might be justifiable. You get less of the policy selection, actually, if anything, on average, but still, sort of, the T-stats is still one. They're not trying even agriculture policy in the poor regions. It's still richer agricultural zones in China. Okay. So any questions on this before I move to the second part of, can we explain the deviation from the positive selection? Okay. So as I said earlier, I want to do two things. The first is that sort of, if we take an optimal design perspective, what does it take for us to justify the positive selection that we see? Can it be optimal, or at least can the optimal experiment design rationale justify at least part of this? And then we're going to go out to the optimal sort of realm and to see other distortions, essentially, in the political hierarchy that might generate this positive selection. Okay, so for the optimal design experimentation, sort of flavor of things that we do, and I wanted to give you a sort of a glimpse of the headline conclusion, is that we're going to take some of the recent, this is actually a fairly recent literature, take some of the recent literature and take some of the modification of additional sort of learning related motivation that you can incorporate into designing the experimentation. And oftentimes they predict positive selection, and we can essentially simulate, given all the parameters that we can estimate from our empirical data, and see how positive selection can be justifiable under this motivation. One such motivation is that besides standard learning, if the central government cares about its subjective expected utility, and if the central government's prior or their beliefs is very asymmetric, and it puts a lot of weight on maximizing subjective utility rather than sort of persuading or learning about sort of the policy per se, it can justify a deviation from randomization. Okay, so even if you push this model all the way to the extreme, if the central government cares 100% about subjective expected utility and have very extreme asymmetric priors, this can only justify a experimentation, optimal experimentation of T-stats on the magnitude of 0.76. Okay, so that's positive selection, but really sort of much a magnitude smaller almost than the positive selection that we observe in our data set. Okay. The second type of sort of justification for positive selection is that we're not in a case of infinite observations. Every place you try the policy, it's a sample that you probably care about its welfare. So it's not about so you can just hold up that sample and then learn for the infinite world. So if the central government cares about the welfare of the experimentation sites, that could justify for deviation from deviation from randomness.
I guess I'm just a little puzzled by considering all of this under the rubric of experimentation. Mm-hmm. In other words, if the government decides that it wants to do this, yeah. Isn't it very smart and close to optimal for the government to say, well, we're going to select a few key points for trial implementation. Mm-hmm. And we don't really want them to be representative, because yeah. Our objective is not to elicit information about whether the policy works or not, it's to right. elicit information about how effectively we can roll it out. So how much does it change things if we think of this as staggered implementation? Yeah. So that's a very important question, and part of the sort of the core challenge of this project is that we don't know exactly what the objective function for this government. We can only make inference and then see, given the various assumptions, can you justify that? Now, the two main issue that related to your comments is that I think it's very likely that, especially for the policies that the central government has a very high priority, that this is something we will do regardless. We just need to figure out the implementation details. And potentially it's better to figure out those details in Shanghai or in a few places that we are comfortable trying those out with. And this is sort of related to a question that came up earlier. That's totally fine, but it's still problematic if the policy, I guess I give the same answer as before, if the policy that you end up tailored in all the implementation detail in Shanghai end up sort of hurt Gansu,
And those are the policies that actually get more likely to roll out to the whole country. And if the central government don't take that into account, that becomes an issue. If the central government are fully sophisticated, I know that I'm trying out the policy only in rich places, and then when I roll it out, I'm going to debias and all this, and then tailor the policy also a little bit for the poor places. Then we'll maybe worry less about that. And hopefully, I have some evidence to show you that they're at least they're not doing 100% of those, and which can become an issue.
Good. I mean, I look forward to the evidence, but at the same time, just in response to that, I mean, if you say we're going to roll it out in Shanghai and Guizhou, that's not going to be representative, but it might tell you what you want to know about different paths. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So to some extent, we're definitely not suggesting that experimentation should always be successful. A failed experiment is it's equally as informative to the central government. Now, the point is, like, the central government seems to be just disproportionately get success cases because the place to try. Another way to put it is that maybe trying policies in Shanghai is not as informative as central government thought, because almost everything you try in Shanghai will work, and trying out in more balanced places might be more valuable. And in fact, sort of this is the quote that I'm giving you. Do central government actually understand representativeness at some level? And that seems to be the case. The National Development and Reform Commission, the FAGAIWei, for example, which is the bureau that guides a lot of the experimentation, very explicitly said getting something close to a balanced sort of sample, being national representative, is something. They're also, of course, they're open about potential alternative objective, which I will talk about in a second. But at least on some level, they understand representativeness is something that they're striving for, and they understand this is something that's valuable for experimentation. Now, it becomes then a question of when the national development form of experimentation, how can you end up getting a t-stats of 10 for some of the trials? Okay. Now, to give you some of the smoking gun of what might be going on here is that the further you're moving away from the central government's direct control over which sites get selected, the further away you are from representativeness. So for the field experimentation where the central government selects a province, and then the provincial government selects the county, you get very close to representativeness at the provincial level, and you get massive policy selection at within province at the county level. Well, that suggests sort of the central government might be wanting the representativeness, but that's not the case for provincial government. And also sort of for the experimentation that allow for voluntary participation, essentially letting local government have a more say of which provinces or which local sites gets into experimentation. They're much more policy selected than the experimentation that's strictly top down and the central government laid out the entire plan up front. And so on.
David, so for officials in Beijing, if they want to do something, you always pick the places that can have an initial successful experiment, right? And then they can report to the top leader, oh, this is really good. We should, spread out to the whole country.
Yeah.
They always have an agenda, right? They will never select a place randomly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. So to some extent, that's part of the, I'm going to tell the story actually in both directions. Central government has some incentive to do that, using experimentation as essentially sort of a, I can essentially manufacture whatever I want to get from the place I tried the experimentation and use this as my political sort of evidence to convince my opponents. And local government might do the same. I'm going to show you some evidence that local government, once they know that this is something central government might want to be successful, local government are really wanted to show that it's successful, and that's going to also generate biases in learning. So that's a very different way of thinking about. Central government just want to learn, and then they just literally want to be very scientifically try things out. And there's very sort of part of the key point if you take away from this talk is that once the experimentation are done in a complex political environment, you're very likely going to deviate from this very scientific modes of just learning and so on. Okay, so we have a bit more to say on the local government side, just because we just don't know what exactly central government is thinking directly. So from the local government side, I'm going to show you, in this case, actually, it's not local government per se, but anything below the very top of the political hierarchy. I can show you two particular cases about the particular misaligned incentive, just to demonstrate. They're not meant to be exhaustive, but they're just to show you a flavor of where the margins where things can generate this deviation from the representativeness. Political patronage is one. So there you can think about a story of, do the ministries, for example, of agriculture, more likely to assign experimentation to the places, the province, for example, that they're connected to, that have been previously worked or have like political ties with. Okay, so we can use the one that's used, the specification used a lot by the literature, looking at sort of the likelihood of a place gets experimentation, regress on whether that particular province is connected to a particular ministry, controlling for the province by ministry fixed effects. That means that all the variations come from a province gets connected to a ministry, not in year one, but in year two, after a new minister gets into the office and gets that particular province gets connected. Okay, so we see a fairly positive and a very large magnitude in the sense of the ministry is very much more likely to sign experimentation to the provinces that they previously have worked relationship or political ties with. And to the extent that you get more of the ministers of China coming from richer places, the richer places end up then on average more likely to get experimentation than the poorer places. That's one source of deviation from representativeness.
So can local governments reject the central government's request of experimentation?
We think yes, not explicitly so, but I think in some sense there has to be sort of implicit consent in this process of central government. I don't think they can force. Maybe at the provincial level, they can exert more effort, but I don't think they can sort of literally just say, no, you have to be part of experimentation and so on. They typically, if there's enough sort of local resistance, they can find a substitutes. So I'm not going to be able to show you much of the resistance. Here, actually, for the misaligned incentive number 2, I can show you the opposite side. Some local government are particularly eager to join experimentation because for the ability to generate political credits. We can look at sort of whether the career incentives of local government and career incentives, you can measure that using the standard things the has been using, which is how much more time in your career that for the next term before you had to retire. And the longer you have, the more career incentive you have to be able to generate political sort of essentially positive cases. And we can use the variation just coming from a discontinuous decrease in political incentive because you're getting very close to the retirement. And then we can again regress that on the likelihood of a particular local government joins the experimentation, and you see very large magnitudes in the sense of, for a local government who have very high political local incentive in the sense of they have more room to go in their political career, they're much more likely to join experimentation, especially for the ones that allow for voluntary participation. And given that on average they're more likely to come from richer places, that's another source where central government may at some point want to be representative, but any floodgate that you open for local government to potentially participate, it's going to generate more of those who are politically motivated local agents to join.
Yeah, but if it's the incentive for the central government person to have his experiment successful, like Hongbin was talking about, maybe they only go choose younger, more potentially more motivated people. So is that a selection at the local level, or just I know lots of times these top level leaders say, I want this guy in this area. So where's the decision making there?
Yeah, so qualitatively, I don't have too much to say. We're sort of in the process of sort of interview some of the former sort of Fagaiwei folks to see how they actually do this. Some of the things that we observe in our data, that it's not just a generic thing about career incentive in the sense of, if you have very high career incentive and you're actually coming from a very poor places, that doesn't quite flip the thing. So in some sense, it's like career incentive interacted with you are coming from on average richer places that gets you into the experimentation. Then sort of a very career motivated person in Gansu didn't quite do much in terms of joining experimentation. Maybe because of some kind of screening from the top level. That's unclear for us. The last thing I want to show you, besides sort of this is not meant to be again exhaustive, but just purely as a counting exercise. If we take into account of the two misalignment of incentive sources that I just show you, patronage and very politically motivated local politicians, just taking these two account can already explain away about 50% of the observed process selection that we see in the data sets. Okay. Now there are other objectives the central government might have that's on top of representativeness and then may actually counteract representativeness. For example, they might want political stability. They don't want to try things out in a place that just had a protest, because any policy sort of change might generate this further disturbance. And in fact, we see that the counties, for example, that just experience political unrest don't get experimentation in the next 3 years, potentially as a veto, essentially, to say that they need political safe environment for that. And to the extent that political unrest more likely to happen in the slightly richer places, that's going to veto out a lot of the sort of more likely to happen in the places that are experiencing sort of economic hardship, and that's going to veto out a lot of the poor places to be part of experimentation. Okay. So the first couple of evidence I want to show you is that they don't seem to fully take that into account. So the underlying sort of logic of this particular exercise is that to the extent there's large heterogeneous streaming effects, and to the extent that there is, on average, positive selection in experimentation sites, that means that the more positive selected a particular experimentation is, the more likely it's going to generate positive policy outcome or signals to the central government. And if that's the thing the central government is evaluating that policy on trial on, that would suggest that those policies gets rolled at a higher frequency than the same experimentation that are slightly less like positively selected. Okay. So then we can look at this non-representative on the right-hand side is essentially the t-stats of the experimentation. So for each experimentation, we can predict whether that policy gets rolled out to the entire country as a function of the underlying positive selection of the policy, the t-stats. And you see a large coefficient, meaning that for every 1 unit increase in t-stats, that increase almost like 2/3 in terms of the base rate of the likelihood that the policy gets rolled out to the entire country. Okay? So another way to put this is more positive selected policies end up more likely to deem as successful by the central government and roll out to the entire country. And note that even for the policy experimentation space that's already selected on central government having a very high prior, not all of them roll out to the entire country. If anything, only a quarter of them become national policies. 3/4 of them get killed after the experimentation and never become a national policy. And the next thing I like to show you is that there are a couple of other pieces of evidence that we can gather to say that the central government just don't systematically sort of ignore orthogonal signals when they evaluate policy outcome, when they evaluate experimentation outcome. So another exercise we can do is that we can look at, say, agricultural policies, agricultural experimentation, and then that experimentation or the policy that's under trial the effectiveness of that policy should have nothing to do with the idiosyncratic natural disasters such as drought or flood that happened during a period of the experimentation for the sites that are undergoing experimentation. Okay, so then we can look at sort of just the agricultural policy and look at the percentage of the experimentation sites that actually gone through or experienced natural disaster during the period of experimentation, which would generate bad outcome for the local economy or for the local agricultural output, but it has nothing to do with the policy. Do those natural disasters actually make that policy on trial less likely to roll out to the entire country? And that's what we see here, which suggests that central government are not taking into account of those orthogonal signals that we think they should get rid of when they evaluate the policy, but that get sort of rolled in to the overall evaluation of the policy. Okay, so if the policy experiment just get unlucky and get rolled out in a few places that experience natural disaster, the central government seems to consider those policies as a failure, and that stopped the policy from roll out to the whole country. Okay. The final two set of facts or results I want to show you is that now among the policies that actually get rolled out to the entire country, what happened to those policies and what happened to the places that experienced the new policy that wasn't being part of the trial? So one thing we can do is that, so consider a policy that take for example the fiscal reform policy that we just had, it got rolled out to half the country. We can then for each of the remaining half of the country that wasn't part of experimentation, we can calculate how close they are to the experimentation sites in terms of their pre-experimentation characteristics, and then we can see whether the closeness of that particular counties to the experimentation sites is related to how positive in terms of effect you're experiencing from the policy. Okay, so this is what I'm showing you in this particular table. The M distance is for each of the policy. We can calculate the non-experimentation sites distance to the experimentation sites among the policies that get rolled out to the whole country. Okay, so the takeaway here is that for the policies that get rolled out to the entire country, the new places that get to experience the policy that wasn't part of the experimentation sites, the further away they are in terms of their characteristics to the experimentation sites, the less beneficial the policy is to them. Okay, the negative here is actually relative, so it doesn't mean that necessarily hurt, but they're benefiting less from policy from places. If another way to put this, if Shanghai tried a policy, the policy get rolled to the rest of the country, Shenzhen benefit equally, but not for Gansu, given sort of how close they are to the Shanghai's pre-expedition characteristics. Okay. Finally, what we can show, and you sort of take this as a grain of thought, given sort of the degree of aggregation here. So this is very much just correlational, and I want to claim anything causal here. For each of the policies that roll out to the entire country in China for the last 40 years, we can trace back how possibly selected that policy was at the time of the experimentation. Okay, and then we can count in year 2010 how many policies that get rolled in that particular year that are massively possibly selected, and how many policies that get rolled in that year that are somewhat representative. And so on. We can zoom into just the economic space because we're looking at sort of the economic inequality. And then we can see what's the share of the policies that are deviating from the experimentation and in terms of making to the final policy on the inter-county inequality that will be measured into the regional inequality in China. Okay, and what you see here is that the more policies that get rolled out in a particular year that's originated from unrepresentative experimentation, the more subsequent inter-county inequality it's associated with. Again, nothing causal here, but there's a very strong association. This is not entirely driven by just policies that get coming from experimentation, because you don't see this possible correlation from policies that coming from fairly representative experimentation. So it's only the non-representative experimentation, once it rolls to the whole country, in the next period, it sort of starts to blow up the inter-county inequality in a subsequent period.
Right. I'm just thinking of one example. Is special economic zone a national policy in the end?
So experimentation zone is not. We don't count that as a policy that can roll out.
As local.
Yeah, exactly. So these are just a subset of policies, about a quarter of the whole experimentation that eventually become a policy that we see. So actually we're fairly strict in a sense, like if a policy that end up having a central government document to say this is the policy that's originating from the experimentation and would not want to do it for the entire country, and wouldn't call that a national policy. And they can change the name or not, that's fine. We can still trace them, but it has to come with a central government document saying this is something the whole country should have. So experimentation zone will not count.
But some of the policies are education, some are pollution, right? I mean, they are all different. But this will affect income inequality differently, right? So
yes, exactly.
Some increase, some decrease, right? So
right. So given that the inequality here is measured just in terms of local GDP, we're zooming into just the economic related policies, and then we can sort of column 2 and column 4 is zooming into. I can call them sort of the more important economic policies. Those are mentioned in the 5-year plan. So those are policies, economic policies that potentially have a bigger bites in changing local economic performance than sort of a random average policy.
Is there, in all of these policies in here are rolled out nationally, or?
So in this regression, yes.
Oh, got it. Okay, yeah.
So the way to understand this regression is that in 2010, 10 policies gets rolled out to the whole country. And these 10 policies has been experimented over the past sort of a decade. And then we look at that 10 policy get rolled out in 2010 at the time of their initial experimentation, how big the deviation they had from the representativeness. And then we look at 2011's inter-county Gini coefficient. And some of the places already had a policy for like sort of 5 years, if they're early part of the experimentation. So I'm coming to the end. So let me quickly summarize, and I'm sort of eager to hear some additional comments that you have. Hopefully, I should show you some set of interesting facts about China's policy experimentation, which is one of the largest scale of such policy experimentation in recent history. Potentially possibly selected. Part of the policy selection is not driven by central government's intention, but driven by some misaligned incentive down the line in the political hierarchy. And that has consequences to the extent that central government don't fully take the policy selection into account. And that started biasing the policy space towards more, towards the ones that are more favorable to the richer places. Okay. I want to link this also a little bit to the literature in economics, that to contrast this with experimentation on the federalism, which is one kind of experimentation that the literature has extensively studied theoretically, which oftentimes predict under experimentation because there are free writing that of the information that I don't have to try the uncertain policy. I can just wait for my nearby counties or provinces to try it. Here, sort of a top-down experimentation might actually generate over-experimentation because of if that sort of induce a lot of the local incentive to participate. But I think a more potentially sort of important lesson from this is that for a large-scale policy experimentation at the level that we're talking about here, this has to inevitably conducted in a very complex environment with various layer of bureaucracy involved. And some of them might involve the very sort of frictions or distortions that the experimentation want to get rid of. But those complex environment could generate systematic misaligned incentive of the way the experimentation is being conducted. And to some extent, it's yet another form of policy capture, but this is capture of the policy at the learning stage, that the information that central government is able to collect are systematically biased, more favorably biased towards the richer places. And that sort of capture the policy towards favoring more rich places, because that's the signal that the central government are evaluating on. And central government doesn't seem to be fully sophisticated of debiasing this per se. Okay, I should end here, and I'm happy to sort of open up more discussions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good, David. Just a question: is that convenient to share the descript summary of your sample in terms of attributes being captured, so we could understand a little bit more? Because depends on type of experiments you have. I wonder if we will have different objective functions, and if you have fiscal policy versus education policy, you might measure the performance in different metrics.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so I mean, eventually our hope is to make the whole sort of experimentation database public once the publication process or it goes through. And hopefully that will help many others to look at this. And in fact, sort of, you're exactly right. Sort of, the outcome space is complicated. That's why I was focusing on the fiscal reform, because the GDP, local GDP performance is exactly what the reform is meant to induce. And some of the education policy, without measuring the sort of the particular dimension that education policy is meant to change, it's hard to map directly into the outcome space. So pollution policy, tax policy often is a few other domains where we can very narrowly map into the outcome space. But you're exactly right. Sort of, it's at least to fully estimate the heterogeneous streaming effects, we can only do this through policy by policy or domain by domain, because there's certain domains we just have no hope of seeing the data the central government might have access to.
Thank you. As a non-economist, looking at the graph that shows the sharp increase in experimentation beginning in the latter part of the Hu Jintao regime, that is concern about slowing growth a driving factor here for experimentation, or is it explicable by increased capabilities within the system as a part of the policy design process to conduct experimentations, or something else?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the answer is I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is that doesn't matter whether you look at the absolute count of experimentation or the share of policies that went through experimentation out of all the policy that's get rolled out to the whole country. It's rapidly increasing very sharply over that period. So it's not just purely because in the 2000s the central government is doing more policies that drive up the share. It's like for every single policy that they will end up rolling, there's a higher share of the went through experimentation stage. I don't have a good take on what drives the increase. We have some sense of like what drives the drop, part of the verticalization, but that increase for the two decade, I don't have a direct answer.
Before Barry, let me just follow up on that. Who implemented that M versus U form regime change? Management change. Yeah. Was that she, or was that done before she got on?
So it started in the very early 2000s, in the very first ministry, actually, I should have known the number, which ministry got it first. And then there was a long lag. And then there's a batch of ministries getting that reform or went through that reform right before the Xi era. So many of the ministries that, imagine, so what that reform means is that it used to be that each provincial government has its own, for example, environmental ministry. That's the previous M form. And then after the U form reform, then the national sort of environmental protection ministry had direct jurisdiction over the provincial one, and provincial government don't have that control anymore. That takes years for many of the ministry to reform over, and I think a lot of them started before Xi. That's why I was thinking the whole drop is not attributed to the extent we can attribute to this ministry reform. It's not attributed to Xi per se.
Barry.
Yeah, if the positive selection is much stronger in policies that are rolled out nationwide, just for reference, what does the sample of policies that weren't rolled out nationwide look like? Does the positive selection disappear? Have you ever
not really. So I don't know the number on top of my head. Policy never end up becoming a national policy. And then the average T-stats is about 1 still. So they're still quite far from representativeness. But I can get you the more precise number.
Because I think that would be interesting. So I mean, this is a great talk. It's really super interesting. And I just wanted to deal with the question of sort of staggered implementation versus experimentation. That would shed light on it. You know, if the positive selection went away in the subsample that was not adopted, that would really strengthen your argument, and kind of, it wouldn't disprove the alternative view, but it sure would make it less likely. So I think that'd be interesting to report as a benchmark.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great idea. And the related one is, at some point, we're also implicitly taking a stance on many of the policies the central government is trying out are meant to be national policies, because it will be a very different sort of conceptual framework if the whole thing is just try to target. That I try out things out and I stop the policy when I see an active effect, and then I only target the places that this policy will become favorable. So and we don't think that's particularly the case for example, for tax policy, for a lot of education policies. But there are certain policy domains which targeting might be more suitable to describe it than sort of, they're actually sort of figure out a national uniform policy per se. But I agree with you. We can sort of further segment the essentially the comparison by different policy types. And
Hi, thank you, David. I think it's very interesting. I think the unrepresentative selection of the reform size is undoubtedly a reason behind the heterogeneous effect of reforms, as it was illustrated in the presentation. But I was wondering if the effect is also due to some sort of like a general equilibrium outcome, like the early reformers got some market advantages, so they perform well. But once the reform rolled out to the whole country, the followers don't have these advantages, and they suffer a little bit more. And so I think you talk about this somewhere in the presentation. Yeah, right. But I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I can't tell you sort of definitively for all the policies, but for a few ones, again because it matters for what kind of outcome we can match it to. For the fiscal reform policy, for example, we don't think it's all driven by Xi or first mover advantage, because for a few counties who get the reform very early on that are poor, they are also lost from the reform. So it doesn't, if you're a poor place, relatively poor place, you lose from this particular fiscal reform regardless of when you get it. And same for sort of the richer place who get the policy later on, they're also on average more likely to be benefiting. So there, I don't think it's all coming from a GE effect. But I can't say this to be true for all the policies out there. There's definitely going to be certain industrial policies, for example, there should be huge first mover advantage, and we don't see that will be sort of exaggerating essentially the incentive for a possibly selected local government to want to join the experiment early on, and further biasing the signal that they get in the first wave of the experimentation to be positive. So let me actually give this is somewhat related to Barry's question earlier, is that from a theoretical perspective, this won't be as big of an issue if the trial error is just sufficiently long. If they try every single policies like for 10 years and eventually reach to poor places and get a negative signal, and they decide this is a bad policy, as they actually end up realizing for the fiscal reform. The fiscal reform policy didn't roll out for the country because the last 3 years, it was very negative, the effect. And that's okay. To some extent, it's just that a lot of the policy get rolled out to the whole country too early. They do the experimentation for 1 year, 2 year, only in Shanghai, and they realize it's good. And then they didn't try out in any of the poor places, and that massive positive signal the central government take as face value, and then they roll out for the whole country. That, I think, is part of the key friction is in this process.
David, I think you try to compare China to the literature about other countries, right? But you didn't say too much about China's different countries.
Yes.
China,
So
the political system is totally different, right? I mean, how the center controls the bureaucrats of the whole country, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is very different, right? Even in China, I mean, even Tom noticed that there's a surge, right, in experimentation during Wu period, right? Also depends on the leadership style, right? Some experiment more, some doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this will change too, right? So in the end, it's about political system, right? So how do you, I mean?
So the way I think about it, and we're sort of in the process of collecting, so 2 sets of data sets we're collecting right now, try to make some benchmark on is, US will be a perfect suitable example to look at for bottom-up experimentation on sort of Massachusetts have one policy, California have one policy that possibly selected, but being rich places, and federal government might decide to make this sort of a national policy and so on. So we'll try to benchmark with sort of the bottom-up experimentation or policy innovation in a federal system than the US. Another version of this is we can look at, for example, all the RCTs that get rolled out by JPAL, for example, that they have internal validity, conditionally on experimentation sites, everything's eternally valid, but then they don't try it out in the random places for the whole country. The compliance sort of set is likely also possibly selected because you don't go to the poorest places or even the representative places in, say, India to do out RCT. So that's another thing we can compare. Now, we'll come back to with this very large theoretical literature. There actually hasn't been much empirical work on this. Is that the typical sort of conclusion from that literature is that in the bottom-up environment, unless you have massive first mover advantage that you want to jump on the policy early on, otherwise everyone just wait because of the risk, and they wait for the first person to try it, and then they decide whether it's good or not, and that's going to on average generate under experimentation. That can be bad actually. So here in China's case, I think is quite representative of a top-down version, is that if the local government have any prior that this is something that the central government would like to succeed because they did a whole operation, they're going to be overly participate, overly zealous about even a not so good policy. And this over experimentation, because of the political incentive of potentially getting promoted and so on, is the exact opposite of what a bottom-up experimentation would predict, because that will predict under experimentation, that the information coming too slowly in those environments.
Great. I think time's up. I think thanks, David, for a really stimulating talk, and we hope to see you here soon.